I'm happy to be here. I find all these Zoom meetings very convenient. 'Cause if nothing else, at least you can take a short period of time and engage with people without being in person. And I hate that as an extrovert and as a people person. It drives me insane that I can't sit and have coffee or sit with meetings and talk about what's going on. Because I actually really love it. My background is in public policy. So more than anything else, I find this kind of situation that we're in right now fascinating and challenging, and appreciate both very much. So this is my third term on the council, and I was privileged enough to serve on the budget committee in the very beginning. That's an appointed position by the vice mayor who allows you to be on budget. And I've been vice chair for 2 years, and then my colleagues asked me to be chair last year and then this year. So it's a position that your colleagues ask you to do, which I guess is normally a very kind and thoughtful thing, and this year has proven to be just exceptionally challenging. Ironically, in most of our committee meetings for the budget, I chair all of them until we get to the actual budget, in which case the vice mayor, Steve Kay, and I basically co-chair. He runs the committee of the whole meetings, and we work very closely together. And he and I may not agree on a lot of specifics, but we both agree on a fair process and making sure that every council member is involved and feels like they are heard, and we go through it in a very, we are very intentional, I guess I would use, on how we try to hold the council together and make sure everyone has a chance to be a part. So we really enjoy working together quite a bit. So because I love public policy and the budget so much, I could spend a very long time just telling you broadly all the things. So what I thought I would do, since you all are well educated, you understand public policy, and you understand the impact of the budget and what it does in the city, I thought I would just spend a few minutes talking about the global perspective of how this has been difficult this year and the challenges that we're facing. And then I really want to leave plenty of questions and time for you to ask specifically what you want to know about, because it's a really big, it's $372 million in the general fund. And so I want to give you some highlights and then leave plenty of room for that. So here are the highlights going in. In a $372 million general fund budget, our biggest chunk of the pie, if you will, is personnel. So 64% of the city's budget is simply people. Our general fund is police, fire, corrections, streets and roads, those kinds of things. Our urban service fund, which is separately, is where you will find things like your trash pickup, waste management. They're a separate fund from us and have separate dollars, as is your water quality, your sewer fund, the EPA consent decree. Those are all in urban service funds, which don't impact the general fund. And in the general fund, we have the other big piece of the pie is debt service. And this year we're running 13% in debt service. It's $47 million. That sounds like a lot. We've been trending towards 10. That's where we have tried to keep our debt service at. That includes our pension bill, the police pension bill that was done back when Gray's administration was here in the very early 08, 09 years. So we've been carrying a very large pension debt bond payment that will roll off soon. So that number is high, but it's not project always. It's also has a great deal of our pension to catch up on our obligations there. And now it's 13%. And you ask why? Well, as our revenue continues to drop, obviously just everything else goes higher. So it's not that we've been adding that much more in the last couple of years. In fact, we've actually not been adding a lot to our bond debt at all. It's just when your revenue drops, those percentages go up. So our debt service is a higher proportion of our budget, even though we're not spending necessarily more money at that rate. The other thing going into this budget that I think is important is that the economy in the pre-COVID world, let's look at January, was very, very strong. Unemployment was very, very low. People were working, people were making money, and it was moving. The economy itself was very strong. What you saw under the surface that we saw as a city government is that our wage growth was very stagnant. So picture some things like this. A person who's been working for a long period of time, retires, they make $100,000. That company hires in that position at $50,000. The employment has stayed. Someone's retired, someone's now employed. The difference is the difference in that wage growth has been dramatic. And so what we've been seeing is wage growth not growing. It's growing 0.5% to 1.5%. while the economy looks strong, where we make the money on the city revenue is on occupational revenue and occupational tax and net profit. So if that gap isn't growing, if wage growth isn't growing, the number of workers and how much they're making, if that doesn't change, our revenues just fall. It's just simple. So our expenses have been growing at 4.5% to 5%, personnel being one of them. If you just think about 64% of our budget being personnel, that the benefits, pension, the obligations there the state has put on us to continue to pay more into that pension bill, and that pension, that's $2.5 million extra every year and growing. Those things are our fixed expenses are growing at that rate while our wage growth is growing at 0.5%. Obviously what happens is those numbers don't add up. We just can't continue that. So in January, the council and the administration have been talking a lot about, we were going into fiscal year 2021, which is the one we're doing right now for coming in July 1, looking at a $4.5 to $9 million budget deficit already. And that was in a pre-COVID world. And you think that's very frustrating. It's frustrating to us too. And so we were talking about big picture things, not just raising taxes, not just cutting services, not just laying off, but really looking at structurally, can we continue like this? And we can't. The city government of 1970s is just not the government you have today. Moreover, the structure and volatility they have and just the way our budget is put together doesn't really function anymore like we need it to. When you look at your property taxes and you think, well, that property tax must pay for the city, it really doesn't. You're looking at 3 cents. When the library gets 3 cents, Lex Train gets 6 cents, your schools take 80% of that dollar. We're getting 3 cents. It's not, we could triple, quadruple the number of taxes, if you will, on your properties, and it still wouldn't help us keep up with the changes in our deficit. So that just shows structurally our revenue for the city doesn't work well at all. So we've been having that conversation already and really talking about how we would present that conversation to the community throughout this summer and this fall, talking about a restructure, an overhaul, relook at how we do things. And basically what we decided to do was take money from an economic contingency fund, which is an amount that the council set up in my very first term 4 years ago when we knew the pension was rising and the state was asking us to give more. We put about $10 million into a fund and basically said we will take $2.5 million from this every year so that we have the extra money to pay the state for the pension. And we were going to take some of that money and delta it this year to cover that $4.5 to $5 million if we needed to, and also really hope that the spring quarter, this quarter we're in, would have been strong enough while we held our expenses. We had kept those 47 positions not funded. We didn't rehire. We had a hiring freeze almost this entire year. We cut back on any extra money anywhere. So those things kept our budget very tight, kept our expenses very, very low. And at the same time, we were hoping that the revenue was strong enough in the economy to help us cover all those costs. So that's the picture going into what was then became a very COVID world. And everything shut down in March, April, May. And that's where we are. So I say all that to say that it's not like we were sitting there thinking everything was jolly and now it's not, and we're just trying to fix one problem, a COVID problem. We are looking at a very different picture for the city. So the mayor proposed her budget April 18th, and she had a little bit more time this year. She and I worked to have a different schedule for the committee and for her administration. So she had a little more time to put together the budget. The problem is it's kind of like homework. You can work on a paper a lot, hours, at some point you have to turn it in. And you turn it in sometimes when it's not finished or when you didn't have enough time or you didn't have enough. I could think of all kinds of things, but at some point she had some variables that had not been known yet and she still had to submit a budget, which is what she did. And now council's in a very similar position. We're reviewing a $372 million general fund budget with lots of unknowns on Zoom. And so when I say this is less than ideal, it is exceptionally less than ideal. We're used to being in a room, spending hours together, going through a large document, looking at every line item, looking through the philosophy of why those line items are there, looking at the long-term impact of those budget decisions that she made. And this has been a very different picture this year. So the challenge looking into it, just from an overall standpoint, is that we had projected a $9 million loss in this fourth quarter. That also projected using about $2 million of that extra, that pension money that I told you about. They were going to use 9 of it to cover 2021 budget and use 2 of it to cover fourth quarter expenses. Well, it looks like our revenue so far, even in March and April, is down $11.5 million. So that $2 million we'll have to use to continue to cover the loss of the fourth quarter of 2020. A couple other little things that she did in her budget that I will just mention. She took out $2 for $1 on external partners. So 5% represents our partner agency's cut. For every dollar she cut externally, she cut $2 internally. So I don't want you to think that the external cuts were light or haphazard this time. She was very strategic in why she made those decisions. And she did reduce government 2 to 1 for those dollars. But it also means when you have 64% personnel and 13% of your debt service, the number that you're playing with to come up with cash and reductions is very, very small. And she made the decision going into her budget that she would not cut personnel. And when you make that decision on the front side, the domino is simply, you can't touch 64% of your budget. You can't touch 13% of your budget. You're left with a very small amount of money to try to make a $45 to $50 million loss out of. It just doesn't work. So the other thing the council did years ago was set up an economic contingency, almost like a rainy day fund, that has very strict parameters on how we might spend that money. Ideally, that money was spent up to cover 3 months or more of our budget. And so the goal was to get to, $45, $50 million eventually, so that we had a good solid situation when things like the ice storm or tornado, one-time expenses, where something happens in our community that's catastrophic, and we use one-time money to cover those costs to keep us whole. So if you look at all the reserves that we have, and we have about 3 different buckets of kind of those monies that we've kept back, the mayor chose to use $30 million of that one-time money to cover the services and the delta of loss in fiscal year 2021. There's not much of an option in that. That's just how she chose to make. When you make the front decision, you make the second decision, which is to use that one-time money. The challenges moving forward, just to be honest, are that you can't make up one-time money the next year. So we're going to be sitting here probably in the fall, if not the later fall, saying revenue continue to fall is the concern through this fourth quarter. It'll fall in the summer, in the beginning of the first quarter of fiscal year 2021. And if that continues, we will be looking at the same $45 to $50 million loss next year, having done everything we've done this year to try to cut and hold. So those are just, I'm going to stop talking now because I feel like I can keep going. So I'm going to stop now and just say that's kind of the premise for how this decision, how the budget was put together. And now council is in a very similar decision-making process, which is how do we continue to find resources to fit a delta that are one-time money, which wouldn't be wise, take any more, while also realizing that the needs in our community are going to be higher. We all know that the impact of COVID, there's dominoes that are getting ready to fall. Housing is going to become a problem, rent, evictions, mortgage losses, all of that job loss. These job losses are higher than the Great Depression, which is just unfathomable when you think about the economy, especially a city that is based on people working to make our money, to make the city work, is catastrophic. And so the needs in our community, we know are going to be higher at a time we're going to have just absolutely little resources to do much about it. And that's just the challenge that we are sitting in today. And with that, I will open it up. I don't know how you planned on doing Q&A, so I don't want to.
Yeah, no, I think this is an excellent time to have questions. So if members of the league, if you have questions, can you please raise your hand, and then Liz can unmute your microphone. So Tony.
I'm trying to find her. Hold on.
Okay.
There you go. Okay.
Thanks, Liz.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for serving on the council and giving a pretty lucid explanation of why we're in the situation that we're in right now, which as you said, is unfathomable. So one of the things that I remember was that so much of the resources that our city takes in is based on the taxes that we raise from people who are employed.
Right.
And that's the primary way that we fund our city government. And maybe I missed this when you were talking. Has there been conversation about, in a depressed economy, other avenues in which the city can raise revenues, which seems to be essential if we're going to even meet the minimum needs of our budget?
Sure. And I appreciate the question, because people have said, have you thought about raising taxes? And what's interesting, and I want to be very just transparent in our conversation, the council had been talking about taxes in general when no one was talking about taxes. I mean, if you'd asked somebody in January, when you thought the economy is going as well as it seemed to be going, the council's talking about taxes, you would have thought we were absurd. And the reason we were is exactly what I explained to you in the very beginning, is that the structure of the way we were getting revenue just doesn't work. 80% of that general fund comes from occupational tax and from net profit. So it just doesn't work. The math doesn't work. And so we had actually, the administration, Mayor Gordon had put together that budget committee who was looking at all the different tax revenues and how we might restructure. So things like a restaurant tax. If we're a tourism city, which we are, and people come here to go to concerts and go to games and participate at UK and do the Bourbon Trail and do horse country, can that 1%, can we add that to our budget? Which would make sense, because we are a tourism city. It's part of our economy, but we're not capturing any of that revenue. That all goes to the state. So that sales tax goes to the state. So we had talked about that. Could we support? And there was talk on council, you know what? We're going to have to look at that. And there was a lot of positive thinking, even though it was this is the consumption tax. When you go out and do it, you participate in that. It's not a direct cost like raising insurance premium tax, which was something else we've talked about. The Fayette County is much lower compared to our neighboring counties, substantially lower than ours on the insurance tax. And so we had looked at, should we raise ours to be the same as our counterparts? And that would help, again, diversify some of our revenue and not rely us so much on occupational fees. The challenge with all of that is that it's the state's decision. And at the end of the day, if the state does not give us, they had to enable us to have a restaurant tax.
Sure.
It would have to enable us to have a 1% tax, for instance, for projects. We talked about the local option sales tax. All of that has to be approved by the state first before we would have the opportunity to pass it here. The only thing that we could have done was the insurance tax raise. We could have done that on our own.
Sure.
Could raise property taxes on our own. And we can raise occupational fees. And at this point, I know the vice mayor feels strongly that we should. Majority of council, from my conversations, had thought this is not the time to do that. That people are already feeling out of work, and we're trying to make sure our economy in this area is business friendly. To raise that now would probably, in my opinion, not be wise. Likewise with property taxes, when you're already nervous about making your mortgage payments, if you're in that bubble, now's the time to do that. Honestly, we're going to have to wait and see a little bit. I think a lot of us are looking at it and saying, okay, let's wait a few more months and see how this really shakes out. Get the community behind that conversation so we can have it, not just with us, but with the entire community.
So can I ask for a little clarification there?
Sure.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that the council has been working on restructuring how the city raises money. And that there are aspects of that the city can do independently, but there are other aspects that it needs the state's approval in order to do. So you can't really get the whole picture until you know what the state will or will not approve for the city.
That's right. So
okay.
That's right. In the pre-COVID conversation, there was talk in Frankfurt, and us in Louisville felt very strongly. The restaurant tax right now by the state is not allowed in Class I cities. So that the bigger ones, which meant for some of our communities down there by and I'm of course blanking on the community I'm thinking of, their neighboring counties can't do that tax, but they can. And so there's a lot of communities saying to Frankfurt, this doesn't make sense anymore. We live global, where the lines don't matter. We all want that ability. And so there was pretty good movement, I think, in Frankfurt at that time to allow us to do that, have this conversation here. And then it all just went away.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for explaining that. And I look forward to supporting the council moving forward. This is a kind of brave new world. So thank you for doing that for us.
Excellent. Thank you for that question, Tony. Does anybody else? Oh, I see Mark has his hand raised. Would you like to ask your question, Mark?
Sure. Thank you for speaking with us. I have two quick questions. I'll ask them both and then let you answer. When you say Frankfurt, is that the legislature or the governor?
Yes. The legislature.
The legislature. And there's been talk of funding to states and localities from Washington. Do you know any more than we do?
Sure. And I said the legislature, they would have to pass it first, and the governor would have to approve the legislation, sign off on it. So it's a both and in terms of taxes or the ability of the city to raise revenue or look at it differently. The other money is interesting, and I say that because it's one of those pieces where it's a variable in this conversation of how we put the budget together. And one of those is the CARES money. And the CARES money was given to the governor, and he just made the formal announcement last week that $300 million of that money, the CARES money, which is specifically COVID-related expenses, will be given to cities, local communities, counties and cities, of which we compete for both. And which is one benefit, is we're going to compete in both of those pots of money for it. And Louisville's the only one exempted from that because they got a direct allocation as a city over $500,000. So they have a different money set than we do. So we're competing with everybody else in the state for $300 million. We're going to get some of it. We think maybe the ballpark somewhere between around $20 million is probably the lower end of that. We hope. We haven't talked about that publicly because we don't know. We just don't know what we don't know what the governor will do. He will give us an allocation, and then we will see what we can do with it. The hard part of the CARES money in particular is that it is right now tied to just expenses that are COVID related. So we didn't build the hospital at UK. UK did. So we're looking at specific resources that we've expended. They're almost all salary related. It's our overtime for police and fire and our budget teams and everybody who was working when people were sent home. And if the federal government does not loosen their restrictions on how they look at how we can spend that money, they could give us $100 billion and it wouldn't matter because we won't be able to use that money towards our expenses. And if we can't use it towards salaries for our general fund, it will be minuscule. It will just not be as impactful as we would hope it would be. Now we hear that may change. We're constantly in that conversation about general fund and revenue. That goal would be if we could use it for some of those expenses, that would refund our general fund and then free up money for 2021. That's ideal. But we're not going to know that probably for another 2 or 3 weeks. That's my gut. As far as additional money that may come out from Congress in the late summer, always a hope, always a potential. But quite frankly, they're in the same boat we are. If no one's paying taxes, no one's got a pot of money that's secret somewhere. So I think what you're going to see from the governor and from a lot of our localities is if it does not come, we're going to have to make some real structural changes in personnel. That's the largest cost for state and cities to function. And I think what you'll see is some layoffs that'll just have to happen because we won't have enough revenue to make those ends meet.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more question because we have, so Dawn Blevins has joined us. And so I think Cindy had her hand up first. So Cindy, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, Amanda, thank you so much. That was a very clear and helpful explanation of the budget. I work on the legislative committee at the state level, and we would be happy to work on the issue of the taxes and the flexibility. And so we need to stay in touch on that. But second, I wonder if you could write up a paragraph, couple of sentences that we could share with our members and encourage them to provide that flexibility you're talking about. because
Sure.
we could get some letters off to Congressman Barr and to our U.S. senators.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I will say, Congressman Barr and I have talked a number of times. He totally understands and has been very supportive of trying to get the regulations. They're already looser than the ones that Louisville got so far, which has been a positive. He's been very supportive and very encouraging and has worked really hard. I just wanted to make sure I said that because he's worked hard to help us do that, and he is
Sure.
doing his best. And I hope that that is something that if we can loosen those restrictions, that money would be far more impactful for us as our community.
Right. We just need the language to share. And even though he supports it, if he has support from his constituents, that
Sure.
makes his voice even stronger.
I'm happy to.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's been really enlightening on our situation, and I'm really glad that you shared that information with us this morning.